Hey guys, some of you may recognize me from my TikToks. I go by BeybladeX usually. Today I'm making my first YouTube video, and I hope you're as excited as I am because I want to talk about something that I have noticed recently between a card game that I used to play very competitively compared to how much I love Beyblade today. So today we're comparing Beyblade to Yu-Gi-Oh! Recently I've noticed that a lot of either current Yu-Gi-Oh! Players or ex-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are moving into the BeybladeX space, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of dig into why that might be and compare some of the things that are an aspect in Yu-Gi-Oh! And why that might attract a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player to Beyblade. So going into it, both have tournaments. A lot of people in both spaces are very competitive. They love the structure of a tournament versus the casual play, which is always enjoyable, but people like to win, right? And both games are highly competitive. Most tournaments are also ran by card shops, which both also host, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Beyblade. So it's very easy for those two communities to kind of collide and be in each other's space and get exposure to that. So that being said, some of the other comparable things that we could talk about is like the combos. Beyblade has combos as far as parts go, and if you use the wrong part, that could be devastating whenever it comes to going into a tournament and doing well with it or doing poorly with it. The same way that your deck list in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck would also make a huge impact in your success and the results that you see from your tournaments. And I feel like those two things are just extremely comparable. Another thing that are super comparable would be your launch tech in Beyblade. You have to be consistent, you have to be skilled, you have to practice, and you have to know what launch you want to use in a matter of seconds. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh! You are timed, but you don't necessarily have to make those decisions as quickly, but at the same time, you still have to be consistent in your combo execution when it comes to following the order of the rules of the cards and playing the cards in the right order to get the results that you want. I feel like those two things are very similar whenever it comes to the game itself. Another example would be in Beyblade. There's a aspect called side preference, where you are given the option to potentially pick the side of the stadium that you want to play on. This can make a big impact because depending on the side that you're on, that could influence what kind of launch tech you use, and you could also make that decision based off of what Beyblades you're using and in what order you're using them in compared to what your opponent is using. And I feel like that is very similar to picking whether or not you want to go first or second in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because depending on what deck you're using, what your opponent is using, whether it's game 1, 2, or 3, you may decide whether or not you want to go first or second, and that would make an impact very similar to the way that the side preference would be in a game of Beyblade. In Beyblade, there are typings such as attack, defense, stamina, and balance. Just like in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where maybe they're not as clearly defined, there are still win conditions that a deck needs to meet in order to be played correctly and to see successful results. So that being said, you've got like attack Beyblades, and then you've got super aggressive Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that just swarm the field with monsters that can swing for game in 1 or 2 turns. In Beyblade, you've got defense and stamina, where you are basically trying to get a guaranteed 1 point. And then in Yu-Gi-Oh! You've got your control decks that use hand traps and basically swarm the field with a negate so they can stop your opponent from being able to do what they want to do, similarly to the way that a defense type is stopping an attack type in Beyblade from doing what they want to do, which is get high points. Another aspect could be the Bey order whenever you're shuffling up between games. So after game 1 in a Beyblade, or after a round in Beyblade, you can change the order of your deck. So you've got 3 Beyblades, and you could choose to put your defensive Beyblade that's in the 3rd slot into the 1st slot. And sometimes that decision is influenced by who has how many points. Very similarly to in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you, after 1 game, can change your side deck out for some of the cards in your main deck to give you an advantage against whatever it is that you're playing against. And I feel like in the same sense, if you're, for example, playing against an attack type heavy deck against your opponent in Beyblade, you might want to put your defensive types at the very beginning of your deck, just to counter that. So those two things are also extremely similar whenever it comes to those games. Both games have random boosters, surprisingly enough. You can go to Walmart and buy a booster of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. It's way more accessible, but still in the same breath, Beyblade has boosters that you can buy off of sites like Basin Bricks and Mall of Toys, and even on Amazon, where you don't really necessarily know what you're going to get, but you have an idea of what you want. I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh players just love the feeling of opening up a pack of cards and getting that prize card, in the same way that Beyblade players like to open up that Beyblade pack and get that prize Bey that everyone really wants. Sometimes it's because there's a great part in there, or it's because it has a part that is an exclusive color you can't get anywhere else. Either way, there's a itch that both games can scratch on almost every level of this game, of both games. Not only that, but there's also deck sets. Recently, there's a Shark Scale deck set that came out with one of the newest and best meta attacking blades in the game. And in the same way, you can also buy a structure deck from Walmart, and if you buy 3 of those, that gives you a play set of everything you need. So essentially, if you just get those things, you can immediately start playing and playing competitively. So both games have an easy way for you to get into them and immediately do well. Both games have their own practicing methods. So of course you can always play test against your friends. Let's say that you're just chilling on a Thursday evening and you don't have anyone to practice with. You can still easily practice on your own. So in Beyblade, there's essentially 2 different ways you can do that. You can either launch one Bey. Typically this is going to be a stamina or defense Bey. That way it doesn't move around too much, because essentially if you don't do that, you might end up extreming a Bey before you can even launch your second. And then you would launch your second, which this method is best whenever you're trying to practice a specific launch technique. Another way would be using a double launcher link. That way you can launch both of them at the exact same time. You can't practice launch technique whenever you're doing this, but it does help you get an idea of what parts are consistent, and it helps you decide if you're trying to pick between a specific bit or a specific ratchet or a specific blade. And then in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can play test on your own. You can set up your field or your mat the way you would against another player. You can draw your hand and just play out what you have currently in your hand. You can kind of think of what your opponent might do on their first turn, and then you can play out your second turn. And that essentially gives you an idea of what your game state will look like consistently in your first 2 turns in Yu-Gi-Oh, which is a very similar aspect of whenever you're self-practicing in Beyblade. So in conclusion, BeybladeX and Yu-Gi-Oh have a lot of similarities that scratch all the same itches when it comes to a competitive game that you might see at your local card shop. Some of those might even be some of the same level of accessories, such as deck boxes, holsters for your decks, and customization when it comes to colors, your stadiums versus your mats, things like that. So guys, what do you think? Do you think Yu-Gi-Oh players are making the swap to BeybladeX? Do you see a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players playing Beyblade as well? And if so, leave a comment below. I'm just really curious to see if you guys have noticed the same things that I have. Also guys, this is my first video, so I would really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and then just leave a comment below on what your thoughts are. It would really push this video to my target audience, which I feel like would be really valuable content that people would appreciate when it comes to both the Yu-Gi-Oh and the BeybladeX space.